Welcome, folks. I know a number of you are just now logging on, and I just wanted to say thank you for joining us on the Friday before Thanksgiving weekend. And while people are still logging in, I just want to say for those of you who are already connected, please be safe this weekend. And I hope you have good times with family. But please keep it to your immediate household, especially given the COVID numbers we saw today are very concerning. So anyway, I hope you all enjoy the weekend. Before we begin, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that Ontario is home to many Indigenous people, and we have a number of First Nation, Métis, and Inuit people who live in communities all across the province. And I'm in Guelph today. And I just want to say, as a settler on this land, I especially want to express my gratitude and recognize that Guelph is on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Adirondack peoples, and is currently the treaty lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And just to express my gratitude for the opportunity to live on this land and to learn from elders and to apply that wisdom to the decisions I make and how they affect the next 7 generations. I want to thank you all for joining us on this really, I think, critically important topic around housing, homelessness, and affordability. And really the purpose of today's conversation is to raise awareness about the housing and homelessness crisis that Ontario is facing, and especially in the context of COVID-19 and the pandemic. And I'm going to introduce Alyssa here in a second, but I just want to just really have an opportunity to talk about the great work that her organization is doing and the role the organization plays in helping people find and maintain adequate housing. And then, of course, we want to discuss some real solutions around the housing crisis. And I've been really proud of the work the Green Party's been doing with our housing affordability discussion paper and all the wonderful and people we've engaged in a conversation, including Alyssa. And so that's sort of why we decided to have this conversation today. We had such a great conversation discussing our housing paper. I thought we should have a live conversation. So I just want to take a moment to introduce Alyssa Brierly, who is the Executive Director and General Counsel for the Center for Equality, Rights, and Accommodation. Alyssa is a lawyer and a public policy professional with over a decade experience in public policy, legal service, research, and operations management. And prior to joining CERA, Alyssa served as the Health, Social Justice, and Labor Policy Advisor to the President of the Treasury Board of Ontario, and as the Director of Policy to the Minister of Economic Development, Employment, and Infrastructure. She's also worked as a legal research and communications advisor to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Right to Food, and as a lawyer and policy analyst at the Ontario College of Teachers. She completed her articling at Torrey's LLP. Alyssa holds a BA from the University of Waterloo, an MA in political science from York, a Juris Doctorate from Osgoode Hall Law School. And I understand, Alyssa, that you're working on your PhD in political science at York University. So you definitely have way more degrees in education than I have. And it's interesting that your political science research is on food in India. And as you probably know, I have a background in food myself. So definitely a lot of shared interest. And so I want to just welcome you and thank you for taking the time out on a Friday before a holiday weekend to talk about an issue that I know you're very passionate about. And I thought we would just begin by just asking you, like, on a personal level, like, how are you doing and how are you managing through this pandemic and this just sort of very extraordinary time?
Thanks, Mike, for having me, and hi to everybody who is joining. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you today about this really important topic. And I also appreciate everybody taking their time out before on a Friday afternoon before a long weekend. I'm doing fine. I'm doing great. Thanks for asking, Mike. It's running an organization, a small nonprofit during COVID has certainly been challenging, and I'm sure that folks are familiar with some of the challenges facing the nonprofit sector during this time in terms of sort of increased needs of the clients that organizations like ours serve, and in some cases the loss of some funding. So there's certainly a lot of organizations who are in a really challenging spot. We're fortunate that we have been able to manage quite well and haven't sort of faced any significant sort of funding challenges. We have had a lot more people calling us. Our organization serves clients who are facing eviction or human rights violations in the context of their housing. And for quite some time during the early part of the pandemic, largely as a result of the eviction, the pause on evictions in Ontario, we had a pretty steady volume of people calling us, but that has exploded in recent weeks when the moratorium has lifted, and so we're really quite busy these days.
Yeah, I was also your opening comments there. Excuse me. Oh man, I drank some water and it went down my throat the wrong way. Sorry about that. If you could just explain a little bit about what CERA does in more detail, and how you got involved in the organization, and sort of your motivation and being a part of the organization.
Sure. So CERA is a nonprofit organization that is focused, broadly speaking, on advancing the right to housing and human rights in the context of housing. We've been around for just coming up to 33 years now, and we focus our work in three main areas. So I mentioned just a few moments ago some of the service work that we do, and that work involves, we have a telephone hotline that folks can give us a call and get some information and support on the eviction process, or if, as I mentioned, if they're having a human rights or facing a human rights violation in the context of their housing, we do interventions on their behalf to try to resolve that. We don't work as lawyers, but we will do as much as we can for folks up until the point where they do need a lawyer, and at that point we will refer folks to legal clinics or lawyers in the sort of private bar. So that's our service work. We do quite a bit of public education as well. As an organization that is focused on rights, it's really, we believe it's really important for people to know and understand their rights and have the capacity to assert them. So we do a lot of education and capacity building around human rights and housing. And then we also do quite a bit of research and, I would say, policy advocacy and public communications around advancing rights. Again, from the standpoint that in order to advance rights, people need to know them and support them, and really trying to build a culture of the right to housing in Canada.
Yeah, and you mentioned briefly, obviously COVID has put a lot more pressure on people's ability to afford housing, but it's also highlighted the importance of housing as well, and having a safe place to quarantine or self-isolate. And I'm curious, you'd mentioned briefly that as the moratorium on evictions was lifted and the landlord-tenant board, starting to reactivate, you've seen an explosion in evictions. And can you maybe just talk a bit about what's driving that explosion in evictions and what its implications are for us as a society?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a really great question. And it's, what's going on right now, back in March when COVID when COVID initially came upon us, the government recognized the real significant problem that having a number of people lose their homes what a significant problem that would be, both from a public health perspective and from the perspective of individuals who were faced with very significant income losses. So we know from COVID, the economy in many respects kind of ground to a halt for at least for a period of time, and many sectors still are effectively not sort of operating as they otherwise would be. So lots of folks found themselves with significant reduction in income, if not no income altogether. So wisely, at the time, the government said nobody should be evicted during this time. That in August ceased to be the case. And so during the intervening time, so between March and August, what didn't change for rent, so what did change for people is that they could remain in their homes even if they weren't able to pay their rent. What didn't change for people is the fact that they did owe rent during those months. And so for many people who were faced with significant loss of income and unable to keep up on their rent payments, is that the amount that they owed their landlords just continued to rise. And so what's happening now is, 5 months down the road, the economic situation for many people hasn't changed at all. And it is quite severe. And the eviction process is now up and running again. And so all that has been done effectively for those individuals who weren't able to pay 5 months ago, pay their rent 5 months ago, is that we've just delayed sort of the eviction process until now. And so effectively the floodgates, so to speak, are open, and those cases are starting to make their way through the system. And there's been quite an increase in the applications that have been filed at the Landlord Tenant Board. I think on average we see 70 to 80,000 eviction applications per year. And during the first I think it was 3 to 4 months of COVID, we saw 50,000 applications. So there is a really significant increase, and we believe there's not data available on this, but based on what my organization and others in the sector have seen, we believe that this is predominantly as a result of people falling into arrears because they just can't afford to pay their rent. They don't have the money to pay it.
So it was interesting. I was listening, I believe CBC Radio had a call-in show the other day on this issue. And it was interesting because you had small landlords phoning in and saying, hey, I can't afford to pay my mortgage and I can't afford to pay the utilities. Like, what am I supposed to do? You had tenants phoning in and saying like, hey, because of COVID, my income is way down. I've lost my job or whatever. I can't afford to pay the rent. Like, what am I supposed to do? And so I'm curious what an organization, like what your organization, just from a public policy perspective, is recommending that government do to address this sort of crisis that we're in now.
Yeah, I think you make a really great point. And I think one of the things that's really important to keep in mind, and I think that your initial comments just highlighted, is that not all landlords or housing providers are the same. The market is very different, and because so many individuals, or let me put it this way, a significant number of the rental housing units that are on the market are actually owned by individuals who have them as secondary properties, or might be renting out part of their own home, whether it's sort of a secondary suite or a basement suite, et cetera. And so their own financial viability as individuals relies on receiving rent from renters. And so that is not the same situation as sort of a large for-profit sort of corporate entity that owns a number of large apartment buildings for whom anyways, it's certainly not the same situation, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And so I think that I think it would be appropriate for government to take different approaches to solving this problem based on the situations that people find themselves in. Effectively, other than the CERB that's been provided at the federal level, which now has been wrapped up and rolled into EI in a way that it's, I think, very unclear and concerning for many advocates how exactly that program folds into EI and whether everybody is captured appropriately. And I think there's a lot of us who are concerned that it doesn't actually catch everybody that needs to have support at this time. Other than that program, there wasn't any real assistance that renters could point to as assistance from the government. So, unlike in the context of commercial rent, where the government put forward a specific sort of targeted program to assist with commercial rents, they've done nothing for individuals. And I think they've sort of effectively relied on CERB to provide that lifeline for people. But we know that that's not enough for many people. The rental rates in many, particularly urban centers across Canada, are just astronomical. And so the numbers don't work for people. So some sort of targeted support for renters would be appropriate. I think that likewise for certain housing providers in certain circumstances, some targeted financial support would be appropriate. But effectively what's happened right now is nothing. a whole lot of nothing, and it's really I don't think it's appropriate, and I don't think it's working.
Sorry to cut in, Mike and Alyssa. We had a few issues with the Facebook Live for a few minutes, so I think a lot of people probably have just joined now. So if you could just take a minute to reintroduce yourselves, and I don't think you have to recap everything, maybe just remind everyone why we're here today, and then resume with the conversation. Then feel free to stay on until about 4:10 or 4:15 if you want.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Jason. Yeah, so I just want to say we're having a conversation here about housing affordability and the public policy response to that. And a lot of our conversation to this point has been really COVID related. I'm going to expand it a bit, and I'm just really pleased to be joined by Alyssa Brierly, who's from the Center for Equality, Rights, and Accommodation. And Alyssa's a lawyer and longtime public policy expert and is actually working on her PhD right now. And Alyssa, I wanted to ask you about, we've been talking about the issues around housing affordability in the context of COVID, but all of these challenges really predated COVID. And so if you look at, the rising numbers of homelessness, we're seeing tent cities in Toronto, but a lot of other communities throughout Ontario. What's driving the affordability crisis, and why are we seeing such increasing numbers of people who are unhoused and in many cases sleeping rough?
It's an important question, and I think it is. I think COVID is exacerbating, to your point, a long-standing issue that has been happening for a very long time. We are in a decades-long housing crisis, and I believe that it's a crisis that's driven largely by the policy environment. And there's a number of policy interventions that have resulted in low vacancy rates, low turnover rates, and the driving up of average market rents by up to 50% over 10 years. So there's a few elements to this. One element is the disinvestment by governments in social housing. Another is a lack of construction of purpose-built rentals. And another is the incentives that landlords have to evict existing tenants to increase rents. And finally, there's a significant amount of financialization happening of housing. And maybe I'll just say a little bit about each of those pieces. So in the 90s, folks who are familiar with the policy environment will understand this very well. But in the 90s, the federal government effectively pulled out of investing in housing, and since that point, there's been virtually no construction of social housing in Canada. There's a few examples that folks point to, but really, if you look at sort of the graphs, every year over the course of time, every year they go up, and then in the 90s they just flatline in terms of the social housing stock. So that has coincided with a growth in population and a significant increase in, I think, inequality and unaffordability for folks. So it couldn't have come at a worse time. Additionally, there's at around the same time, majority of the large multi-unit buildings that were being constructed and have been since that time have been condos, not purpose-built rentals. And so over the past 3 decades, the construction of rental housing stock as well, not just social housing stock, but rental housing stock has not kept pace with the demand or the needs that people have. And this is, this is what economists would call a market failure. And then on an individual level, landlords have a very strong financial incentive to evict tenants who pay rent that is less than what the current market rate is. Because there is, we have rent control in Ontario, which prevents landlords from raising the rent year over year beyond a certain prescribed amount. But when a unit becomes vacant, landlords can raise the rent to whatever they would like. So we hear from people who are in their homes for 25 years, 30 years, who you can imagine, in Toronto could be paying something like $800 a month, but the average current market rent for a 1-bedroom unit is in the whereabouts of $2,300. So there is a huge incentive for the landlord to find a way to get that individual out of their home so that they can bring in somebody else who will pay them literally 3 times as much. And once individuals in those circumstances are pushed out of their home, these are usually, at least the folks that we hear from, they're folks who are low income, a lot of seniors, persons with disabilities who have been in their homes for a long time. And once they're pushed out of their homes, they often have no choice but to either work extra jobs, move away from their communities to the extent that they can find somewhere else in Ontario where they can afford to pay the rent. And that's becoming more and more challenging all over the province. Sometimes they limit their spending on necessities, sometimes they couch surf, sometimes they stay with friends or family, but those folks are at very serious risk of becoming homeless.
And so I think you've done a very good job of sort of outlining the challenges. What are some of the public policy tools you think government can use to address the challenges that we're facing?
Great question. I think the entire starting point of understanding and addressing the issue needs to shift. Housing is a human right, and governments need to start acting like it's a human right and recognizing that. And as they would with any other human rights issue, they wouldn't sort of take a step back and just hope that the private sector figured it out. And so governments really do need to adopt a rights-based approach to housing. And what this looks like is prioritizing the issue, directing resources to solving it, and treating it the way they would any other human rights issue. In terms of specifics, I think, at a high level at least, what this looks like is incentivizing the construction of the kinds of housing that people need. So, using regulation and financial and tax incentives to make it easier to build affordable rental housing, supportive housing as well, and social housing. It means disincentivizing the treatment of housing as a financial commodity, which is becoming increasingly nefarious and another way that people are being sort of pushed out of their homes. It means providing housing for people for whom the market is failing. So housing for low-income marginalized individuals, folks who can't afford housing at current market rates, and making a priority for housing the homeless, because homelessness is an egregious human rights violation, and that is widely understood and recognized within the human rights community. And we've just, over the course of the last several decades, kind of given a collective shrug to this issue and not really done anything to address it in a meaningful way. And then finally, one thing we haven't talked about, but this is part of the work that we do at CERA, is regulating the rental market more appropriately to prevent the kinds of discrimination and human rights abuses that happen by housing providers, because they do happen quite often. And I'm referring to the sort of the discrimination that happens against providing housing to people, people who are people from equity-seeking groups, and the denial of housing to people in those groups because they're part of those groups. So discrimination against individuals who are newcomers to Canada, for example, or persons with disabilities, or persons who are on social assistance, and also the kind of housing rights violations that we're seeing more and more of in terms of illegal evictions. It happens all the time. Illegal evictions, pressuring people to move out of their homes so that they can replace the tenant with somebody who will pay more for the rent. That kind of thing needs to stop. And so there's a role for government in all of this, I think. And I think with the right, when government is willing to appreciate that housing is a human right, then these are the types of things that would naturally come to mind as being kind of the place to start.
Yeah, one issue that you brought up a couple of times that I don't think is that widely understood, and understood in the context of its contribution to the housing crisis, is the sort of financialization of housing and the number of people looking at housing from a speculative standpoint versus housing being for people's homes, being more as speculative financial instruments. And can you maybe talk a bit about that and how that's contributing to the housing crisis?
Absolutely. It's a huge issue, and it's something that not a lot of people are aware of. So I think it's really important to highlight. So financialization of the housing market, or maybe I'll take a step back. Housing has, in Canada, housing, it's not as though housing wasn't a commodity or wasn't treated as a commodity before this point in time. There's, lots of people had housing as sort of a secondary, they would have a secondary home that they would rent out, and so there's nothing sort of new about housing as sort of an investment on a small scale. What financialization of housing is referring to is the sort of large phenomena of, or the phenomena of large financial actors, so multinational corporations in particular, making a business, a very profitable business off of housing. And the way that this is being done, that is very, and what is really problematic about the way that this is happening is that there are large companies whose business practice is to purchase older buildings that that aren't sort of offering the kind of amenities that many folks have come to expect in the current market. Large buildings that have rents that are well sort of under the average market, Those buildings are purchased. The new owners renovate them. In so doing, they kick out the current tenants, and then they bring in new tenants who are willing to pay much more for those new renovated units that have all the sort of modern comforts and bells and whistles. And there are companies that have done this all over the world. It's happening in Canada, but it's happening all over the world as well. And they have displaced thousands of people, some of the most vulnerable people paying the most affordable rents. And their actual business model is based on displacing people from their homes. And then if that wasn't the worst of it, there are investors that invest in these companies like real estate income trusts and pension funds that are providing significant amounts of funding to allow this to happen. And these investment vehicles are present in many of the kind of standard investment portfolios that people have these days, whether it's mutual funds or exchange traded funds or pension funds, et cetera. And so there's this entire sort of market going on in the background, this complex financial market going on in the background that is a business model that is literally built on the premise of displacing low-income individuals from their homes. It's despicable.
Yeah, and we're starting to see that. I think, at least in the context of Toronto, a lot of people are seeing a lot of the apartment buildings that were built 20, 30, 40 years ago are being sort of bought up by these types of financial models, is my understanding.
Absolutely. It's happening in Toronto, and it's happening all over Canada. So it is very problematic, and yeah, it's extremely problematic. And there's to my knowledge, there's nothing really being done to try to stop that from happening in terms of regulation or incentives, et cetera.
So I know we need to wrap up soon, and all of us go on and enjoy our holiday weekend in our very limited bubbles. I wanted to ask you, so, an issue that, we're seeing so much of right now is the tent cities that you're seeing, in communities all over Ontario. At Queen's Park, there's literally Queen's Park Circle, people living in tents. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts of, what's the best way for government to address that issue in a way that ensures that, we take a housing first approach and actually house people appropriately, rather than taking a punitive approach and, just try to move them somewhere else, so to speak.
Absolutely. So, I think the important thing when we think about people living outside in tents, encampments, tent cities, whatever we're referring them to as, I think we need to ask ourselves why they're there in the first place. I don't believe it's the case that people want to live in a tent in a park in the middle of a city. That I don't think that's anybody's first choice. There are no options for people, and this is what people do when there are no options for affordable housing. Many of the individuals living in encampments in Toronto are folks who have been offered but are not comfortable with the indoor spaces that they have been that are available in shelters, for example. And that was the case before COVID, but it's become even more serious as a result of COVID, because we know, and we have been told for the last 6 months from our public health experts, that we should be isolating, and we should not be in sort of congregate indoor spaces. And yet, for many folks living in encampments throughout Canada, throughout Ontario, that is the only option that they're being given. So it shouldn't be surprising when we see people following public health advice and living outside in a tent, because that may be their safest and best option. what we really need to be doing is finding ways to create the safe indoor housing that people need. And there is some really good work being done. I can speak, certainly the City of Toronto has been procuring indoor spaces in hotels and is working to try to get folks inside. I think that there's still quite a bit to go, because there are still many people outside and need safe indoor space, and winter is just around the corner. So that really does need to happen with all deliberate speed. But that's one thing that governments can and should be doing, certainly. And then in the long term, of course, a hotel is not a home. People need housing, affordable housing, and this is a really significant, I think, piece of work that government needs to take very seriously.
Great, appreciate that. And so I was just thinking, so also I really appreciate the work you do, the expertise you bring to this work, the work that CERA does, and I'm just curious if you have any parting thoughts, or if there's anything that you think we haven't covered in this conversation that you think is a really important issue for people to be aware of. Maybe we've covered it all.
I can't think of anything that we haven't touched on, but I will maybe just take an opportunity to do a quick plug. If folks are interested in our work, they can find us at equalityrights.org or on social media at CERA Ontario. And for folks in Toronto who are interested in learning more about the work that we're doing with the Right to Housing Toronto Network, they can find that on r2hto.ca and follow us on social media as well.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time on a Friday afternoon, holiday weekend, to have this really important conversation. And I think, as we've said in this conversation, COVID has really highlighted the systemic challenges we're facing in providing housing for everyone. And I'm hoping it's going to give government the incentive and the impetus to really address the systemic issues that you've shown so much light on today. So I really appreciate you taking the time, and thanks for all the expertise you bring to the table on this issue.
Thanks so much. It's been my pleasure.
Great. So everyone, be safe. Have a good Thanksgiving holiday, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk again soon on another topic of importance. So be safe, be well, and take care.